Hi there, and welcome back to 19th Century Art. Today we're going to talk about photography. It's hard to imagine that not even 200 years ago, no one had ever seen a photograph before. Now they are everywhere, so ubiquitous that anyone at any time can take a picture and send it to any corner of the earth instantly. Photography has indeed changed, and so has our perception of what it is and what it can do. So in this lecture, we're going to examine how those changes came about and the way it has influenced our thinking about images. So the technology for the camera has been around for a long time. In the Renaissance, they knew this trick of creating a tiny hole in a wall would allow just a fraction of the light in to project a reversed image of what was on the other side of the wall. If the room was sufficiently darkened, you could see the image clear enough, and people would transpose the image, drawing it as it appeared upside down. So the camera obscura, as it is called, here it is as it appeared in the Encyclopedia by Denis Diderot, was a well-known device. The challenge that faced the 19th century was how to fix the image that the camera obscura created. And this required some special chemistry and other kinds of tools to be able to bring this image into focus and into a lasting and permanent form. So Joseph Nifor Nepi was the first to really create a photographic image. It was interested in making a lithographic stone positive based on a camera obscura image, and fixing the image proved to be an extraordinary problem. But we can see here the rough outline of the view outside his window in 1826. He called this first experiments heliography. Initially, Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre was thinking about a tool that would be something an artist might use. So instead of creating a cartoon, a preparatory sketch of a picture, the artist would create a photograph. And then from that photograph, they could derive their work. Daguerre worked on objects that would sit still for a long period of time, as he recognized that the exposure might take half hour to 45 minutes. So in these early pictures, we see these objects rendered in fascinating detail. Daguerre then turned the picture outside, and as we can see, he captured the view of the Boulevard du Temple in 1838. This picture took 20 minutes, and he was able to get the image over a long exposure and fix it with extraordinary clarity. Now, the curious thing about this picture is it looks like there's only one person down there in the lower left. A person is having their shoe shined. But the reality is their street was full of people, but because they were constantly moving, the camera didn't pick them up. The man having his shoes shined, standing still long enough that his image could be captured by the camera. In the first exhibition of Daguerre's images, Paul Delaroche proclaimed, "From today, painting is dead." Now, this wasn't the first time people saw the end of painting from one thing or another, but it clearly speaks to an existential dread that painters who mimicked reality, the kind of challenges they would soon face when a machine in a few minutes could do something that they would labor over for days or weeks. In Britain, another man who was an inventor and a bit of a tinkerer began experimenting on fixing the camera obscura images, and he took a different approach. Henry Fox Talbot developed the calotype, which was first creating a paper negative, and then by wetting and attaching it to yet another piece of paper and exposing it for the correct amount of time, he could create a positive image. And so this was the first time we have a print negative. This allowed for someone to make copies of a picture. This was an important development that Daguerre's work did not allow. Daguerre's work was fixed on a sheet of glass, and so it was a positive from the beginning. Talbot was a bit of a dabbler. He didn't really see what he was doing other than anything an inventor might think of as a curious challenge. He never saw the implications or the full scope of what he was doing. And the problem with the calotype was it was not a completely fixed image. So when people came to see his print pictures, they could see them darkening before their eyes. The photograph was taken on the road by Roger Fenton, who in 1855 went to the Crimean War, and he was charged with creating a record of the battles. Of course, the camera Roger Fenton brought with him was so laborious and so large that he could only really capture the aftermath of the battle. Or in the case here, his very obliging assistant who sat completely still for 20 minutes. He helped establish the Royal Academy of Photography, but Fenton was unsuccessful to get photography recognized as an art. In a very curious image, we have a picture sent back from the Crimean War by Roger Fenton in April 23, 1855. And we see this picture here, a street strewn with cannonballs, which is the picture that he submitted to the newspaper. And he wrote in a letter, "In coming to a ravine called the Valley of Death, the sight past all imagination, round shot and shell lay like a stream at the bottom of the hollow all the way down. You could not walk without treading upon them." Indeed, we can see that in the picture quite vividly. Curiously, another picture surfaced, and it shows no cannonballs actually in the road. And it's much less dramatic for that reason. And a number of people have examined both images, and it came to the conclusion that based on the way the shadows have fallen in this image compared to the first one I showed you, the first one was actually taken later, and that he had gone and tried to make the image more dramatic by moving cannonballs out of the gully there and rolled them back up onto the road to create a more interesting picture. And this is part of the problem with early photography. People looked at it to be a precise record of history, but more often than not, the pictures were staged. Take, for example, in the Civil War, which was also one of the first major wars to be photographed, Alexander Gardner has a picture of the home of the rebel sharpshooter from 1863, and we know from accounts that this photograph was entirely staged. A body was dragged up and a rifle was placed in a spot that had been where a sharpshooter had been killed, but in fact, it was entirely staged now for the photograph. Because it took so long to expose these pictures, people stood incredibly still and had to be asked to stop whatever they were doing in order for the camera to record. So we have an amputation being performed in a hospital tent at Gettysburg, and everyone, included in the patient, is standing perfectly still. We have pictures of famous people for the first time. Abe Lincoln, taken not far from here in Urbana, Illinois in 1848. Here he is without a beard. And a new photo of Emily Dickinson has emerged in recent year, which was discovered in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1995. Extraordinary photo of Emily Dickinson. As you can see, she's holding a very slight smile, which would have been hard to do considering that most people were completely staged, propped up, and held in place by these mechanical anchors to make sure they didn't move while the picture was being taken. Back in Paris, the celebrity Gaspard Félix Tronchin had been a caricature artist, and then he learned of photography and was absolutely entranced by its potential. He was the man who really brought photography to the celebrities of the 19th century, and his studio became a magnet for famous people from all over Europe. He originally intended to photograph the people so that he could then make a caricature of them, but the photographs themselves proved more popular than the caricatures. Here, if you recall, is Daumier's caricature of Nadar in a hot air balloon, and he did many such things. He brought cameras underwater, in the dark, up in the air. He was trying to make photography this extraordinary scientific record of the age. Nadar became so famous that his studio, which opened in 1854, proudly pronounced in a signature across the upper floor. Nadar did a brilliant job of capturing the beauty and mysterious elegance of Sarah Bernhardt, and we'll talk more about her extraordinary career as an actress later. The way he captured her in this classical way, with her leaning and turning and wrapped in this dramatic cape, just this wonderful sense of delicacy and those piercing eyes. The photograph became also a window to another place. People began collecting images of faraway lands and exotic locales. Maxime Duchamp's mission to Egypt and the Near East from 1849 to 1851 used a salted paper print to beautifully capture this Egyptian statue. Far out into the west, in the deep, inaccessible wilderness, we have Charlton E. Watkins, the American, who went to Yosemite and captured this exquisite picture of Hapdome in an albumen silver print, which gives you this really rich blacks and this deep range of light and grays to create this very powerful and dramatic image. Back in New York, Jacob Riis was using the camera as a social critic. He and others who took up the challenge of criticizing the rich and the powerful businessmen were known as muckrakers. He set up his camera in the very poorest parts of the city and captured the ordinary lives of the most poor and most destitute of the tenements of New York. And he created a book which he sold called How the Other Half Lives, Studies Among the Tenements of New York, 1890s. So Jacob Riis was a Danish immigrant to the U.S. in 1870, and he struggled to find work. He was hired as a police reporter for the New York Tribune in 1877, and he used his photos for talks on the state of the immigrant poor in the United States, and he became quite famous for shedding light on the desperate situation of the poor in New York. And it's because of him that laws were created to ban the sort of practices of crowding people into these tiny apartments. Here we see Bandit's Roost by Jacob Riis, and you can capture this really both amazing photograph of the shadowy alleyways of New York in the late 19th century. He befriended Theodore Roosevelt, who was the governor of New York at the time, and he called Jacob Riis the best American I ever knew. And he really had a tremendous heart and care for the people of New York. Back in Paris, Eugene Auger was despondent about the destruction of old Paris. So he set it upon himself to begin photographing the old neighborhoods and the wandering, twisting, narrow streets, much of which had been destroyed through the modernization programs of the mid to late 19th century. So he felt it was the sort of urgent job of his to try and bring some record of this quickly vanishing part of old Paris. He had an exquisite sense of light and composition that made his works truly memorable and celebrated as art. One of the things he enjoyed was photographing these long exposures of shop windows and the reflections and the multiple layers of images reflected in the shop windows. It's just really a tremendously wonderful and exquisite picture. Auger himself also was quite fascinated by the poor and the destitute of Paris. Like Jacob Riis, he went out to the region known as the Zone, which had been designated a very specific geographical area. There was the strip of wasteland that stretched the outskirts of Paris between the location of the old fortifications and the suburbs. And so this zone here was where the people of the city who had been pushed out because of the modernization taking place inside the city. This is our first example of the effects of gentrification in the city of Paris. Oscar Gustave Regendler was trying to create the idea of photographic art. And so to do that, he wanted to create a photograph that was also a history painting. And he assembled more than 30 separate photos together, exposing this one image multiple times to create this complex composition that represents two young men who have gone either into the world of decadence and excess and the world of charity and moderation. And we see them divided here, going their separate ways with their father in the center, alarmed by one and honored by the other. So this was actually very popular. People really enjoyed the fact that the photograph was putting into service of something that was clearly recognizable as art. But for many people, it really didn't capture what photography did best. Peter Henry Emerson was the first to really argue that photography had its own unique aesthetic qualities, and that simply photographing nature in an honest and direct way, you could beautifully capture the qualities of light and pattern that the eye would otherwise miss. So he made naturalistic photography a cornerstone of his ideas about what photography could be. When he explained his philosophy of art and straightforward photography, it was like a bombshell dropped at a tea party, because the case it made that truthful and realistic photographs would replace contrived photography. Here we see two men in a boat, and we see them picking a lotus from the lake, and the light is really quite exquisite. And he's really capturing the qualities and the attention. He's not trying to create a soft, focused picture or something that has a painterly quality, but he's allowing that richness of detail to come in and be an important way in which we see the exquisiteness of this natural scene. The man who truly brought the idea of photography into the idea of art was Alfred Stieglitz. He had moved to New York, and here you see him taking a photograph of the steerage, which were the common people who are the last to leave the boat. And he saw in this composition something very strikingly modern, the way the gangplank and the ladder, and then this pipe and this beams, and framed these people and this exquisite barrage of shapes and textures and shades and values of gray all mingling together in this very exciting way. So it really feels very modern. It's moving into a way of talking about the photograph as a way of capturing and expressing this abstraction that what the photograph does is really translate lived experience. It doesn't merely record it faithfully as art. It transforms our picture plane. It makes us see the thing as it is through the camera lens as art.